On the night the SS Waratah vanished, the ocean didn't roar, it swallowed. No distress call, no wreckage, no bodies, just silence. A modern passenger ship, praised as unsinkable, carrying 201 souls, erased from the map off the coast of South Africa in 1909. They called it the Titanic of the South, but unlike Titanic, there were no survivors to tell the story. The Waratah departed confidently into calm waters and was never seen again, or so they say. Hours after its last transmission, witnesses reported something impossible: a massive vessel fighting against monstrous waves, listing violently, lights still on, as if refusing to die. Then it vanished into darkness. Official reports contradicted each other. Coordinates didn't match, records disappeared, and over a century later, the mystery of the disappearance still haunts maritime history. How does a ship this large simply cease to exist? And why does every attempt to explain it only deepen the unease? What makes the SS Waratah more disturbing isn't just that it disappeared, it's what it left behind. A final message that didn't sound like an emergency. Witnesses who changed their testimonies years later. A captain known for caution, suddenly accused of recklessness. And an ocean route already linked to other unexplained vanishings. When search teams arrived, they found nothing, not even debris, as if the sea itself had erased the evidence. Then came the rumors. Unstable design flaws buried by shipping companies, strange behavior reported on board, and a last sighting that placed the ship somewhere it should never have been. The more investigators tried to reconstruct the final hours, the more the timeline fractured. And buried within those contradictions lies a question no one can answer. Did the Waratah sink, or was it never meant to be found? Before we go any further, understand this. What you're about to hear is not a story with clean answers. It's a reconstruction built from silence, missing records, and a mystery of the disappearance that was never officially resolved. If this is the kind of investigation that keeps you watching, the kind that refuses easy explanations, subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. New cases emerge here, not because they're popular, but because they were abandoned. And as you listen, pay attention. If a detail feels wrong, if a theory doesn't sit right with you, leave a comment. Sometimes the truth survives only because someone notices what everyone else ignored. In the early years of the 20th century, the ocean was no longer feared in the way it once had been. Steel had replaced wood, steam had replaced sail, and confidence had replaced caution. It was an era when humanity believed it had finally mastered the sea, when shipping companies spoke openly about ships that could not sink, routes that held no danger, and voyages that promised certainty. It was in this atmosphere of absolute trust that the SS Waratah was born. A modern passenger liner designed to connect the far reaches of the British Empire, carrying immigrants, businessmen, families and cargo through what was considered a routine maritime corridor. No one boarding the ship imagined they were stepping into one of the darkest chapters in naval history, a chapter defined not by wreckage, but by absence, by silence, by the mystery of the disappearance. Launched in 1908, the Waratah was celebrated as a triumph of engineering: spacious cabins, electric lighting, advanced navigation equipment, and a hull believed to be exceptionally stable. Newspapers praised her, advertisements promised safety, and comparisons to the finest ships afloat were common. More than a decade before the Titanic would make that word infamous, confidence in unsinkable vessels had already taken root. The Waratah was not just another ship, it was a symbol of progress, of modernity, of control over the unpredictable. Yet from her earliest voyages, subtle warnings began to surface. Passengers whispered about strange movements at sea. Crew members noted an unusual role, nothing dramatic enough to delay departures, nothing serious enough to trigger official concern, just enough to be dismissed. What makes the SS Waratah unsettling is not only that it vanished, but that it did so completely. 211 people, men, women and children, disappeared without a single confirmed survivor. No lifeboats drifting, no cargo washing ashore, no bodies carried by currents. The ocean, usually generous in its cruelty, returned nothing. The ship left its final port along the South African coast and simply stopped existing in the physical world, leaving behind only paperwork, testimonies, and contradictions. For investigators, this absence became the most disturbing clue of all. Disasters leave debris, sinkings leave traces, but the mystery of the disappearance of the Waratah offered only questions. Over the decades, the story has been retold as a maritime ghost tale, a footnote overshadowed by later tragedies. But beneath the surface lies something far more troubling. Reports that don't align, timelines that fracture under scrutiny, authorities that grew silent too quickly, and witnesses who claim to have seen a ship fighting impossible seas, lights burning against towering waves, as if the vessel itself resisted the moment of erasure. The SS Waratah did not simply sink into the ocean, it slipped into uncertainty. And once a ship enters that space, between history and oblivion, it never truly leaves. It lingers, unresolved, suspended in the dark waters of the mystery of the disappearance. The final confirmed moments of the SS Waratah were unremarkable, and that is precisely what makes them so unsettling. On July 26, 1909, the ship departed Durban, South Africa, continuing its return voyage to Cape Town before heading onward to Europe. There was no sense of urgency on deck, no emergency drills, no last-minute delays. Captain Joshua Ilbery, a seasoned mariner with decades of experience, commanded the vessel with the quiet confidence expected of a man who had spent most of his life at sea. Those who observed him that day described nothing unusual in his demeanor. He did not rush, he did not hesitate, and he did not know that this would be the last time his ship would ever be seen with certainty. Passengers waved goodbye from the rails as the shoreline slowly receded. Families leaned into the wind. Crew members carried out routine duties with mechanical precision. The Waratah was heavily laden, transporting not only people, but a significant cargo: wool, lead, and other materials destined for international markets. Some later theorists would fixate on that cargo, arguing it altered the ship's balance, but at the time, nothing appeared out of order. Weather reports suggested rough seas further along the coast, but nothing outside what vessels regularly encountered in those waters. The route was known. The dangers were familiar, and Captain Ilbery had navigated worse. The last verified sighting came not from a distress call or a radio transmission, but from routine maritime observation. Other ships traveling along the same corridor logged the Waratah's presence earlier in the day, placing it on a predictable course, hugging the eastern coast of South Africa. Then, gradually, the trail went cold. No message followed. No adjustment to course was reported. The ship's wireless, a relatively new technology at the time, remained silent. For hours, that silence meant nothing. Ships did not constantly communicate. Absence of contact was not yet alarming. It was only in hindsight that this quiet would take on a terrifying weight. What complicates this final sighting are the accounts that emerged later. Several witnesses, including crew members aboard other vessels, claimed they had seen a large ship matching the Waratah's description battling enormous seas sometime after its expected passage. They described a vessel listing heavily, lights still visible, rising and falling between walls of water. One observer would later say the ship appeared out of control, yet not abandoned, as if something aboard was preventing evacuation. These testimonies were never fully reconciled with official logs. Times did not match, locations conflicted, and the ship those witnesses claimed to see existed only in memory, not on any chart. Captain Joshua Ilbery himself became part of the mystery of the disappearance. Known for his cautious approach, he was posthumously criticized by some as reckless, accused of pressing forward when conditions demanded retreat. Yet no evidence proves he received weather warnings severe enough to justify such claims. His final decisions remain frozen in time, unrecorded and unknowable. The last time the SS Waratah was seen, it was simply a ship doing what ships do, moving forward. And then it crossed an invisible threshold, where certainty ends and speculation begins, leaving behind nothing but the haunting question of how an ordinary departure became a permanent farewell. Reconstructing the final hours of the SS Waratah is like trying to assemble a timeline from fragments pulled out of deep water, incomplete, warped, and often contradictory. What investigators know for certain is disturbingly little. After leaving Durban on the afternoon of July 26, 1909, the ship followed a familiar coastal route, expected to reach Cape Town within days. This stretch of ocean was not unknown territory. It was heavily trafficked, carefully charted, and routinely navigated by vessels of similar size. On paper, the Waratah's journey should have been uneventful. Yet somewhere along this route, the timeline fractures, and the mystery of the disappearance truly begins. Weather reports from the period describe a developing storm system moving along the South African coast that evening. Strong winds, heavy swells, rapidly changing sea states, conditions capable of testing even well-built ships. But storms alone do not erase vessels without a trace. Other ships pass through the same region before and after without incident. According to logs, the Waratah was last plotted moving steadily southwest, maintaining speed, maintaining course. Then the records stop. No deviation, no slowdown, no call for assistance. It is as if someone simply lifted the ship out of the sequence of events. Hours later, the window of uncertainty opens. This is where estimates replace facts. Some reconstructions place the ship encountering the storm late that night. Others suggest it may have entered the worst conditions closer to dawn. Witnesses from passing vessels reported seeing a large ship struggling against extreme seas sometime during this period, but exact times varied wildly. Midnight, early morning, before sunrise. Each account slightly shifts the timeline, moving the possible point of disaster dozens of miles in either direction. The ocean corridor where the Waratah could have vanished expands with every contradiction. Adding to the confusion is the absence of wireless communication. By 1909 standards, the Waratah was equipped with modern radio technology, capable of sending distress signals, yet none were received. This has fueled decades of debate. Did the disaster happen too quickly? Did a sudden capsizing leave no time to transmit? Or was the wireless room rendered unusable before the crew could react? Some have suggested the ship may have lost power first, an event that would plunge it into darkness and silence simultaneously. Others argue the radio was operational until the end, raising the possibility that no one had time to understand what was happening. As days passed with no arrival in Cape Town, concern grew. But even then, the uncertainty of maritime travel delayed alarm. Ships were late, storms caused detours. Only when the Waratah missed every reasonable window of arrival did the timeline crystallize into something undeniable. The ship was gone. Somewhere between its last confirmed position and its expected destination, an event occurred that erased 211 lives from history. No one knows the exact minute. No one knows the precise location. The chronology collapses into a single terrifying truth. The SS Waratah entered a moment from which there is no recorded return, and in that blank space between known points lies the deepest core of the mystery of the disappearance. At first, no one panicked. In 1909, the sea taught patience, not urgency. Ships ran late, weather forced detours, mechanical issues delayed arrivals. When the SS Waratah failed to appear in Cape Town on schedule, harbour officials marked it as overdue, nothing more. There was no blaring alarm, no immediate mobilization, no sense that 211 lives were already lost. The ocean still allowed hope, and hope postponed action. This delay would later become one of the most haunting elements in the mystery of the disappearance. Days passed. Still no ship. Shipping offices began checking routine channels, port records, wireless stations, expected checkpoints along the route. Nothing. No sightings, no messages, no confirmation that the Waratah had diverted or docked elsewhere. Families waiting in Cape Town scanned the horizon. Business partners asked questions that received no answers. The absence was subtle at first, like a missing sound in a familiar environment. Noticeable, but easy to ignore. Only when other vessels arrived safely from the same waters did concern harden into something more serious. The first true alert did not come from authorities, but from the growing realization that the ship had missed every possible margin of delay. Weather could explain hours, maybe a day. It could not explain complete silence. Shipping company representatives were contacted, and internal inquiries began quietly, almost reluctantly. There was hesitation to declare a crisis. Declaring a ship missing carried consequences, financial, reputational, political. Each hour without confirmation deepened the uncertainty, but official statements remained cautious, carefully worded, deliberately vague. Wireless operators along the coast reviewed their logs. No distress signals, no fragmented messages, nothing garbled. This absence was deeply unsettling. Even in catastrophic sinkings, something usually escaped, a partial transmission, a panicked call cut short. The Waratah had left no such trace. As concern grew, the narrative began to split. Some believed the ship had found shelter or diverted unexpectedly. Others feared a sudden disaster, too fast for warning. Without evidence, every theory floated freely, untethered to fact. Public attention intensified when newspapers began reporting the delay. Headlines asked careful questions rather than making accusations. Overdue steamer, unreported arrival. The language reflected uncertainty, not alarm. Families of passengers clung to those words. Overdue meant still possible. Unreported meant still alive. Authorities did little to challenge this optimism. There was no immediate search order, no naval mobilization. The sea remained unchecked, as if waiting for confirmation before revealing the truth. Only after the ship had been missing far beyond any reasonable expectation did the tone change. Quiet concern hardened into dread. The first alerts, delayed and restrained, had allowed the ocean to close over whatever evidence might once have existed. By the time officials acknowledged the severity of the situation, the SS Waratah was no longer a late arrival. It was a vanishing, and the mystery of the disappearance had already deepened, shaped not just by what happened at sea, but by what failed to happen on land. When the reality of the SS Waratah's absence could no longer be softened by cautious language, authorities were forced to act. What followed was an official search that would later be remembered less for what it found and more for what it didn't. Naval vessels were dispatched along the suspected route. Coastal patrols scanned the horizon for lifeboats, debris, or even oil slicks, the faint signatures that usually mark a maritime disaster. The ocean offered nothing, not a plank, not a crate, not a single piece of evidence to anchor the mystery of the disappearance to a physical place. Search ships moved methodically, following currents, tracing the edges of storm systems, checking regions where wreckage might naturally drift. Crews expected to find something, anything, that could confirm a sinking. The absence quickly became disturbing. Even the most catastrophic shipwrecks leave traces. Wood floats, cargo surfaces, bodies are carried by tides. But the Waratah seemed to have dissolved into the water without resistance. Days of searching turned into weeks, and confidence gave way to quiet disbelief among those tasked with finding answers. As the search expanded, so did the uncertainty. Without a confirmed last position, the area to be covered grew enormous. Witness accounts of a struggling ship were considered but treated cautiously. Their timing didn't align. Their coordinates conflicted. Investigators found themselves chasing shadows across thousands of square miles of ocean. Each failed sweep made the task more futile. The sea off South Africa is notorious. Powerful currents, deep waters, unpredictable weather. But none of that explained the total erasure of a vessel of this size. Behind the scenes, pressure mounted. The shipping company faced scrutiny, insurers demanded clarity, and governments sought closure. Yet the search yielded no definitive conclusions. Eventually, official efforts began to scale back, not because answers had been found, but because resources were finite and evidence non-existent. The decision to reduce the search was framed as practical. To many families, it felt like abandonment. The ocean had claimed their loved ones, and now silence followed from those meant to speak. Years later, technological advances would revive hope. Sonar scans, deep-sea expeditions, private searches driven by obsession rather than obligation. Each promised resolution, each ended the same way, with empty screens and unanswered questions. Some believed the wreck lay buried under sediment. Others argued it had broken apart beyond recognition. But even modern searches failed to explain how the ship could vanish so completely. The official search for the SS Waratah did not end with discovery. It ended with exhaustion, a quiet admission that the sea had won. And in doing so, it transformed a maritime incident into something far more enduring, a case defined by absence, by unanswered questions, and by a mystery of the disappearance that no amount of searching has ever been able to close. When the searches failed, and the ocean refused to give up even the smallest fragment of truth, speculation rushed in to fill the void. The disappearance of the SS Waratah demanded explanations, and in the absence of evidence, theories multiplied rapidly. The earliest explanations were practical, grounded in what sailors and engineers already feared: storms, waves, and human error. Yet each theory, when examined closely, revealed cracks that only deepened the mystery of the disappearance. The most immediate theory pointed to extreme weather. The waters off South Africa are notorious for sudden storms and rogue waves, towering walls of water capable of overwhelming even large vessels. Supporters of this explanation argued that the Waratah may have been struck broadside, capsizing so quickly that no distress call could be sent. But this raised uncomfortable questions. If the ship had capsized, where was the wreckage? Where were the lifeboats? Even a violent storm should have left traces. The ocean's complete silence weakened the theory rather than strengthening it. Another line of reasoning focused on cargo. The Waratah carried heavy materials, including lead and wool, loaded deep within the ship. Some believed improper loading or shifting cargo could have destabilized the vessel, making it dangerously top-heavy. This theory gained traction when early passenger accounts resurfaced, describing an unusual rolling motion during previous voyages. Yet official inspections had cleared the ship repeatedly. No documented violations, no recorded instability severe enough to justify catastrophe. Once again, suspicion existed without proof. Attention then turned to the ship's design. Critics suggested the Waratah may have had a dangerously high center of gravity, making it vulnerable in rough seas. This theory was uncomfortable for shipping authorities because it implied structural flaws that had been overlooked or ignored. While some engineers later argued the design was sound, others admitted the ship's behavior at sea was unusual. The lack of consensus kept the debate alive, unresolved questions multiplied. More controversial theories soon followed: mechanical failure, engine room flooding, sudden loss of power. Any of these could explain the radio silence, but none explained the absence of debris. To account for that, some suggested the ship may have sunk almost vertically, plunging into deep water before breaking apart. It was a possibility, but one that relied heavily on perfect timing and catastrophic precision. Each theory tried to impose order on chaos. Each offered comfort through explanation, and each collapsed under scrutiny. The initial theories did not solve the mystery of the disappearance. They exposed how little was actually known. Instead of answers, they created a maze of possibilities, none of which fully aligned with the known facts. The SS Waratah remained suspended between logic and doubt, its fate explained in many ways, yet understood in none. As theories accumulated and certainty eroded, investigators were forced to confront a disturbing reality. Some pieces of evidence surrounding the SS Waratah simply did not behave the way evidence should. They didn't clarify the story. They destabilized it. These fragments, scattered across witness accounts, documents, and later investigations, formed what many would come to call the impossible evidence at the heart of the mystery of the disappearance. The most unsettling elements were the sightings. Multiple witnesses, independent of one another, described seeing a large vessel in distress along the South African coast on the night the Waratah vanished. They spoke of towering waves, a ship listing heavily, lights still burning against the darkness. The descriptions matched the Waratah's profile closely enough to be alarming, yet the times did not align. Some placed the sighting hours after the ship should have passed that location. Others placed it far outside the official route. To accept these accounts meant accepting that the ship was either off course, delayed in ways never recorded, or somehow existing in two contradictory timelines at once. At this point in the story, one thing becomes clear. Some disappearances are never meant to be solved quickly. They demand patience, attention, and a willingness to sit with uncertainty. If stories like this, stories buried by silence, contradictions, and time, matter to you, consider subscribing to the channel. Activate the notification bell so you don't miss the next investigation, because many of these mysteries connect in ways that only reveal themselves over time. And if you're forming your own theory about what happened to the Waratah, leave it in the comments. Sometimes the most overlooked detail comes from someone who refuses to stop asking questions. A like also helps this story reach others who are searching for answers the official record never provided. Then there were the coordinates. Later reconstructions placed the ship in areas inconsistent with its expected speed and direction. To reach some of the reported locations, the Waratah would have had to alter course significantly without notifying anyone. An unlikely decision for a cautious captain like Joshua Ilbery. And yet, those locations corresponded disturbingly well with known zones of extreme wave activity, where massive swells rise unpredictably from deep-water currents. The coincidence was difficult to ignore. Perhaps most troubling was what did not exist. No distress signal, no fragmented transmission, no accidental broadcast. In an era when even partial radio messages often survived disasters, the total silence was statistically rare. Investigators debated whether the wireless room had been rendered inoperable instantly by flooding, power loss, or structural failure. But even those scenarios required a sequence of failures so precise it bordered on improbable. Documents added further confusion. Some shipping records appeared altered or incomplete. Logs referenced weather conditions that did not match external reports. Small discrepancies were dismissed individually, but together they suggested something was being misunderstood or omitted. Whether this was incompetence, bureaucratic error, or deliberate suppression remained unclear. The impossible evidence did not prove what happened to the SS Waratah. It proved something else entirely, that the available facts refused to form a coherent narrative. Each attempt to align them produced contradictions. Each effort to close gaps created new ones. Instead of pointing toward a conclusion, the evidence pushed investigators deeper into uncertainty, reinforcing the idea that the mystery of the disappearance was not just unsolved, it was resisting solution. As contradictions multiplied and public curiosity intensified, something else became increasingly noticeable. The quiet. Not the silence of the ocean, but the silence of those expected to speak. After an initial wave of statements, reports, and cautious explanations, authorities began to withdraw from the narrative of the SS Waratah. Questions went unanswered, updates slowed, official interest faded with unsettling speed. And in that absence of communication, the mystery of the disappearance took on a darker shape. Shipping companies issued brief, carefully worded declarations that offered no new information. Government agencies echoed those statements, repeating known facts without addressing inconsistencies. Requests for deeper investigations were deflected with technical language and procedural finality. The case was framed as tragic but closed, despite the complete lack of physical evidence. For families seeking clarity, this sudden institutional fatigue felt deliberate, as if the story had become inconvenient. Behind the scenes, pressure was mounting. Admitting uncertainty threatened reputations. Acknowledging possible design flaws risked financial fallout. Extending searches without new leads invited criticism. Silence became the safest option. Over time, documents that could have clarified the ship's final hours became harder to access. Some records were lost. Others were archived without explanation. Inquiries were quietly discouraged, framed as speculative or unproductive. The official inquiry into the disappearance produced conclusions that sounded definitive, but rested on assumption rather than proof. Phrases like "presumed lost at sea" replaced investigative language. The shift was subtle but powerful. Once a ship is presumed lost, urgency dissolves. Without urgency, questions fade. The absence of a wreck allowed authorities to control the narrative, or abandon it altogether. This silence extended beyond governments. Maritime institutions, insurers, and engineering boards showed little appetite for reopening uncomfortable discussions. Public interest waned as new tragedies captured attention. The Waratah slipped into obscurity, not because it was understood, but because it was unresolved. And unresolved cases demand effort that no one seemed willing to provide. For some researchers, this silence became evidence in itself, not proof of conspiracy, but of avoidance, of a system that preferred ambiguity over accountability. The mystery of the disappearance survived, not only because the ocean hid its secrets, but because institutions chose not to challenge that concealment. The SS Waratah was lost once at sea, and then lost again in the quiet spaces where answers should have been. Long after official interest faded, fragments of the SS Waratah's story continued to surface in quieter places. In personal letters, in private interviews, in recollections shared decades later by those who had once been close enough to feel the ship's presence without being swallowed by it. These hidden testimonies never reached the authority of official reports, but together they formed a shadow archive, offering unsettling perspectives on the mystery of the disappearance. Among the most compelling accounts were those of passengers who had sailed aboard the Waratah on earlier voyages and refused to board again. Some described an uncomfortable rolling motion, a sense that the ship did not right itself naturally after heavy seas. Others spoke of objects shifting unexpectedly, of doors swinging with unnatural force. At the time, these concerns were dismissed as seasickness or imagination. Only later did they gain significance when the ship failed to return. Crew-related accounts were rarer, but no less disturbing. A few sailors reportedly expressed unease about the vessel's handling, particularly in rough conditions. One claimed the ship felt top-heavy. Another suggested it responded sluggishly to corrective maneuvers. These statements were never formally recorded during the ship's operational life. They emerged only afterward, filtered through second-hand sources, making them easy to dismiss and impossible to fully ignore. There were also stories from coastal residents and lighthouse keepers who believed they had seen unusual lights offshore on the night of the disappearance. Lights that appeared stationary, then vanished abruptly. Some interpreted them as another ship. Others suggested distress signals, never officially logged. No records confirmed these sightings, yet their consistency across independent accounts gives them an eerie credibility. Perhaps most haunting were the testimonies that surfaced years later, altered by time and reflection. Witnesses who had once given vague or cautious statements later expressed regret, claiming they had withheld details out of fear of ridicule or pressure from authorities. Whether these revisions reflect truth or the reshaping power of memory is impossible to determine, but their existence reinforces the sense that the full story was never told. Hidden testimonies do not solve the mystery of the disappearance. They complicate it. They blur the line between fact and perception, between warning and hindsight. Yet they also remind us of something essential. Official records capture only what institutions choose to preserve. Everything else, the doubts, the fears, the moments of unease, survives only in human memory. And sometimes it is in those fragile recollections that the most unsettling truths reside. With no wreckage to mark the end of the SS Waratah, the ocean itself became a suspect, vast, shifting and unforgiving. Investigators were left to imagine not a single site of disaster, but a corridor of uncertainty stretching along the South African coast. This region, where the Indian Ocean collides with powerful currents and volatile weather systems, has claimed ships before and since. And within it lie multiple locations where the mystery of the disappearance could have unfolded. One of the most frequently cited areas is the stretch influenced by the Agulhas Current, a fast, narrow, and extraordinarily powerful flow of warm water moving southward along the coast. When opposing winds strike this current, they can create abnormally steep waves, some described by sailors as appearing out of nowhere. Modern studies confirm these conditions are capable of generating rogue waves large enough to overwhelm massive vessels. If the Waratah encountered such a phenomenon, it may have been struck with little warning, in a region where survival margins collapse instantly. Another possible location lies farther offshore, in deeper waters, where search efforts would later struggle. Some reconstructed timelines suggest the ship may have drifted or diverted eastward, either intentionally to avoid the worst of the storm or unintentionally due to currents and wind. In this scenario, the ship could have sunk in depths where debris would be less likely to resurface and where wreckage would remain buried beyond reach. This theory aligns disturbingly well with the total absence of physical evidence. There are also coastal zones marked by underwater canyons and sudden drops in the seabed. A sinking in such terrain could scatter debris downward rather than outward, trapping it in deep pockets invisible from the surface. These locations are notoriously difficult to survey, even with modern sonar. Multiple expeditions have scanned sections of this seafloor, each narrowing possibilities without confirming anything. The ocean floor remains silent, offering shapes without identity and shadows without answers. What makes these locations more unsettling is their connection to other maritime losses, ships that vanished under unclear circumstances, vessels found years later far from their expected routes. Patterns that suggest the region itself plays a role in erasing evidence. Whether coincidence or correlation, these overlapping mysteries deepen the sense that the Waratah did not disappear in isolation. The places where it could have happened are not defined by coordinates alone. They are defined by conditions, violent, unpredictable, and hostile to certainty. Somewhere within this shifting geography, the SS Waratah crossed from known waters into absence. And until that crossing point is found, the mystery of the disappearance remains anchored not to a place, but to an endless stretch of sea. When conventional explanations fail, deeper theories emerge, not because they are comfortable, but because the mystery of the disappearance demands something more than surface-level reasoning. These theories move beyond storms and navigation errors, reaching into design flaws, institutional behavior, and the unsettling possibility that the truth was recognized early and quietly set aside. One of the most persistent deep theories centers on the SS Waratah's stability. Engineers later suggested the ship may have had a dangerously high center of gravity, making it vulnerable to sudden, irreversible rolling. In calm seas, this flaw could remain hidden. In heavy weather, it could become fatal within seconds. If a single extreme wave struck at the wrong angle, the ship might have listed beyond recovery, capsizing before the crew could react. This theory explains the absence of a distress call, but it raises a more troubling question: were warning signs known and ignored? Another theory explores institutional suppression. Shipping companies had enormous financial incentives to protect their reputations. Admitting a design flaw would have triggered inspections, retrofits, and public fear. Some researchers argue that early internal assessments may have identified stability concerns and quietly buried them once the ship was lost. The rapid closure of inquiries and the disappearance of certain records lend weight to this suspicion, though definitive proof remains elusive. More speculative interpretations suggest a chain of cascading failures: structural stress, shifting cargo, flooding, power loss, occurring so rapidly that the ship became unmanageable almost instantly. In such a scenario, chaos would replace procedure, leaving no time for signals or evacuation. The Waratah would not have slowly died, it would have been overwhelmed. There are even darker theories, rarely voiced officially, that connect the ship's fate to a broader pattern of unexplained losses in the region. These ideas do not rely on the supernatural, but on the convergence of extreme environmental forces that are poorly understood even today. If true, the Waratah may have been destroyed by conditions that science has only recently begun to document. Deep theories do not offer closure, they offer context. They suggest that the mystery of the disappearance persists not because answers are impossible, but because they may be uncomfortable, costly, or inconvenient. And sometimes, the deepest truths are the ones least likely to surface. To reconstruct the final hours of the SS Waratah is to walk a narrow line between evidence and inference, between what is documented and what must be imagined. Yet when all fragments are placed side by side, the weather reports, the sightings, the ship's known behavior, the silence that followed, a chilling sequence begins to take shape. Not as a certainty, but as the most coherent version of events the mystery of the disappearance will allow. As night fell on July 26, 1909, the Waratah was likely approaching one of the most volatile stretches of ocean along the South African coast. The storm system intensified faster than predicted. Winds shifted, waves steepened. The Agulhas current, moving with relentless force beneath the surface, amplified the violence above. For most ships, this would have meant caution, reduced speed, altered heading. For a vessel already suspected of unstable behavior, it may have meant something far worse. Inside the ship, the motion would have changed abruptly. Rolling that no longer felt rhythmic, objects sliding instead of swaying, passengers retreating to cabins, assuming discomfort rather than danger. Below decks, cargo strained against its restraints. If even a portion shifted, the ship's balance would have degraded rapidly. The margin for recovery narrowed with each passing minute. Then came the critical moment. A wave, not merely large but steep and asymmetric, struck the vessel at precisely the wrong angle. Witnesses later described a ship fighting enormous seas, lights still burning. This suggests power had not yet failed. The crew may have attempted corrective maneuvers, engines straining, helm responding too slowly. For a brief window, the ship remained alive, resisting. That resistance may be what doomed it. As the Waratah listed heavily, water would have poured through openings never designed to face the sea directly. Flooding would have been sudden, uneven, catastrophic. If the list exceeded the ship's ability to right itself, recovery would become impossible. In that chaos, reaching the wireless room may have been futile. Even if a message was attempted, it may never have left the antenna. The final plunge may not have been dramatic at the surface. No explosion, no drawn-out sinking. Just a rapid loss of stability followed by disappearance into deep water. If the ship capsized and sank bow first, debris would have been pulled downward rather than scattered. The ocean in this scenario did not merely claim the Waratah, it concealed it. By dawn, the sea had erased the moment entirely. No wreckage surfaced, no signals echoed. The ship existed only in memory. This reconstruction does not solve the mystery of the disappearance, but it transforms it from an abstract question into a human tragedy, one defined by seconds, decisions, and forces that left no room for survival. More than a century has passed since the SS Waratah vanished into the waters off South Africa, yet its absence remains louder than any wreck ever found. Ships have been lost since, disasters have been documented in brutal detail, but the Waratah occupies a different space, one where history ends without punctuation. No final photograph, no coordinates etched into charts, no remains to mourn. Just an open wound in maritime memory, sustained by the mystery of the disappearance. What makes this case endure is not simply the loss of 211 lives, but the way the truth seems to retreat every time it is approached. Each expedition promises answers. Each technological advancement raises hope, and each time the ocean responds with silence. The deeper we search, the more the Waratah seems to resist discovery, as if its fate is bound to remain unresolved. Not because it is impossible to find, but because it challenges our belief that every tragedy can be explained. The ship's legacy extends beyond its own story. The waters it vanished into are tied to other disappearances, other incidents where evidence thinned and certainty dissolved. Patterns emerge, not patterns of conspiracy, but of vulnerability, roots where modern confidence meets ancient forces. The Waratah reminds us that progress does not erase risk, it merely disguises it. Captain Joshua Ilbery's final decisions remain unknowable. The passengers' final moments unrecorded, their voices were never captured by radio waves or survivor accounts. They exist only in the questions left behind. And perhaps that is the most unsettling truth. Some stories are not meant to conclude. They linger, demanding attention long after official files are closed. Today, the SS Waratah is still out there, not just as a physical wreck waiting to be found, but as a challenge. A reminder that silence can be evidence, that absence can be louder than debris, and that the mystery of the disappearance is not a failure of investigation, but a confrontation with the limits of certainty itself. Somewhere beneath shifting currents and crushing depths, the answers may still exist. Or perhaps they dissolved the moment the ship crossed into darkness. Until the day the ocean gives up what it has hidden, the SS Waratah will remain what it has always been. Not just a lost ship, but an unanswered question drifting through time, waiting for someone brave enough to keep asking. And if the Waratah could vanish without a trace, how many other stories have already done the same? The SS Waratah vanished without a final message, without survivors, without closure, and more than a century later, the mystery of the disappearance still waits for someone to challenge the silence. If you believe these stories deserve to be remembered, documented and questioned, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. Every new investigation depends on people who choose not to look away. Leave a comment with your thoughts, your doubts or your theory, because this story doesn't end here. It continues with those who engage with it. And if this video kept you watching, if it made you uncomfortable, curious or unsettled, a like helps ensure that these forgotten disappearances are not forgotten again.